Thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. I wanted to have everyone talk a little bit about themselves, what their background is, what their history is, particularly as it relates to the topic. And then I'll ask some questions, but mainly it's going to be free-form, organic, whatever we want to call it, where I want not only me to ask questions, but I want each of you to ask questions of the other so that we kind of don't have this gap where it kind of has to come back to the moderator. I don't like that model. So anyway, Dan.
Sure. Hi, I'm Dan. I work for Samsung, and I'm going to be presenting after, right? So I can tell you more about me then. But relevant to this discussion, I'll do a lot of work in W3C. I'm on or I co-chair something called the Technical Architecture Group in W3C, where famously W3C does a lot of royalty-free standardization work. So I'm kind of coming at it, and I've also, however, I work for Samsung, I used to work for Vodafone, I have worked for Telefonica, I've also worked for the UK government, and part of my work for the UK government was helping to define the open standards principles, which include royalty-free standardization as an important aspect in order to enable open source deployment. So I'm kind of coming at it from that perspective, and I know that that makes me seem like a radical leftist or anarchist in some scenarios. However, I just spent the weekend at FOSDEM, and I can assure you that from their point of view, I am definitely center-right in my views, right? So I just wanted to kind of establish that there's like a spectrum of views on this. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, just thinking about where I am on the spectrum, on that spectrum. So hi, I'm Sachiko. I'm the chair of an organization called Open Forum Europe. Interesting you mentioned the open standards principles. I think we actually, the organization was founded actually in the UK, and we were involved in that process leading up to the, yes. Yeah, and we, I think, even after the publication of the open standards principles, we wrote our organization's mission statement, I think, based on some of that work, adapting it to the work that we're doing. So that's really good work that you did there. I am also a senior researcher at RISE, which stands for Research Institutes of Sweden. That's a state-owned research institute. I do research on open source and standards. My PhD was on policy intervention into standardization, so I'm one of the few people here. I mean, I guess the totality of people are passionate about open standards or are in this room right now, so I'm one of those people. Anyway, I wasn't expecting to talk about my whole history, but anyway, those are my
the high points.
Some highlights, yeah.
I mean, I had my slide up just earlier. I'm Tim, former lead engineer under the De Beers Diamond Blockchain project. So preventing the world from having blood diamonds through using machine learning and blockchain tech. I'm a specialist in network technologies, and I'm really passionate about open standards and their implementations in the kind of broader telco space.
And the great thing is all the panelists are complementary to each other, but very different. And so it's the prep session for this, quite frankly, you do this as much as I've done it. Sometimes it's not so surprising, but this was surprising how interesting the conversation can be. To kick it off, I'd like to just contextualize the background that kind of gives rise to this, the messiness of the world of standards development and the formal processes of standards development, and the presumption that everything that has gone on historically needs to go on, even though the world is changing dramatically, and the social movement that is open source is really helping to transform the world that we live in. But it's almost not been properly taken note of by the people that are involved in traditional standards development. And I think that needs to change. So a few comments I'll make about how I would remake the context for people to understand it. very often I've been faced with discussion questions about patents equate to innovation. To me, it's an unsupportable proposition. It's bad science. There are patents that capture claims that are highly support innovative breakthroughs. The reality is that equating them, irrespective of what the content is of a particular claim set in a patent, is irresponsible. And this is something that underlies, and I think Sachiko will talk a little bit more about this topic, but it underlies a fundamental belief that's existed since patents were originally promulgated, that these are a product of innovation. It's also laziness that encourages governments and research institutes to equate patenting with innovation. And there's also incremental innovation and radical innovation, and you have to look at the two. Incremental innovation is not so interesting, quite frankly. Radical innovation, where we transform industries or create new ones, that's the sexy stuff. That's what we should be looking for. And patents that do that, yeah, we give the credit to those patents, and we look at those as being innovative. But overall, patents are not a major source of innovation. Correlating a company, nation, or region's innovativeness to numbers of granted patents is misleading, directionally interesting, but misleading and insufficient. Many granted patents contain overly broad claims, are not sufficiently novel, and are granted absent a full and thorough investigation of prior art. The analyses are done too quickly, with too little information, too little access to information, and too little assistance from the broader community through crowdsourcing and other methods like that. Most patents should have never been granted. That's just a fact. It's kind of incontrovertible. So I think we can, you can have plenty of people from the patent world talk to you about that. I'm from the patent world, and I know of what I speak. Ad hoc standards are increasingly prevalent in the open source, and in an open source centric world, project-based innovation, which is what I call the kind of innovation that we're dealing with. I don't think most other people characterize it that way, but to me, it's about having successful projects, managing them well, and having the output of those projects be innovation. I think it's highly misunderstood, and I think because we have project-based innovation and because we have ad hoc standards being developed, there's a smaller space for formal or traditional standards development processes. Open source is really this, as I said, it's a social movement, and the modality of collaborative development which it embodies is a major and growing source of innovation that is not properly understood or appreciated by industry, even and let alone by government and regulatory authorities. That has to change. Royalty-free licensing is legitimate and useful. We have to understand that there isn't only one flavor or one model that we can go by, and I think the free codec program that exists right now that Meta and Google and Microsoft are formally behind and aggressively behind, it's essentially allowing us to see that by using an open source model where you're required to, if you want to adopt the code, the codex, you have to convey, I don't know that we need that, convey the patent rights to patents that you have that read on the functionality captured in that codec. Lots of companies that are big monetizers and want to leverage their patents without encumbrances don't like this idea. They have to get over it and recognize that we are moving toward different models, and some of the models that we're going to talk about now, particularly I'd like kind of Dan to live in the slipstream and kind of take the conversation and talk about his view on openness and royalty-free licensing, and that it's not only its credibility and value, but how it's something that we should see more of.
So the one thing that comes to mind, and we talked about this a little bit in the discussion prior to the panel, was I think I've worked for a lot of patent-interested organizations, patent-heavy organizations. Samsung is one of them. Vodafone is another. And in all those organizations, the work that I have been engaged in is focusing on royalty-free standards. And very often, once you, when you explain the royalty-free patent licensing of organizations like W3C, and Linux Foundation has a similar approach with the
AV1.
the JDF, the Joint Development Foundation licensing pass-through. Organizations, once they understand that they're not giving away their intellectual property, they are actually licensing under very specific terms for royalty-free implementation. Then organizations like Samsung and Vodafone tend to be a lot more comfortable with that, especially when they see the benefits to being able to allow the open source ecosystem to take advantage of that intellectual property to build stuff on those standards. Because the nature of those royalty-free licenses is that you're licensing it for implementation of a specific standard. Why are those organizations interested in that standard? Because they want people to build an ecosystem on top of that standard because they feel that they have a commercial interest. It's an all boats rise kind of thing. So I think that I've seen that work in many different spaces, including the web, obviously, but also more recently C2PA, this work on content labeling, where we're contributing it all the way through the ISO path, but it is a royalty-free standard. So in some cases, I think there is a false dichotomy between royalty-free and traditional standards mechanisms, and also with which is not necessarily anti-patent either, I guess is my point.
Yeah, so many things to pick up on
You
there.
can take it anywhere. Any of the topics I mentioned, you can take it in those directions too.
Just choosing. I don't come from the patent world. I have a policy background. But the thing you mentioned there about sort of how there is a notion that innovation equals patents. I think ideas like that tend to become entrenched in institutions, legislation, various, when governments are measured by how innovative the economy are, there are indices, and, I was involved with Open Forum Europe and Fraunhofer. A few years ago, there was a study that the European Commission asked us to carry out on the economic value of open source. And even for that, study, the professor that was in charge of measuring the impact of open source on innovativeness, etc., had a hard time finding other indicators other than patents. So, and I know there's been some development on that now with the WIPO index, which also now includes a measurement of developer contributions also to. But I think just a few examples where I encounter this is that we participate in Horizon projects, European-funded projects, where there's a lot of interest in sort of promoting open source or developing, European-wide projects that produce open source technologies. But at the same time, if you look into each sort of a funding agreement, there is a section on IPR policy. Every Horizon project needs to kind of contain a plan for how we are going to, I forget the term now, but sort of, how are we going to protect, any IPR that results out of the research. So there is a kind of, it's built into institutions, policies, legislation, this notion. And I think if we're going to change that, and with my organization, we have been trying to promote in European standardization the introduction of a royalty-free option for European standards. But there needs to be, for change to happen, there has to be an understanding that there is something lost if, there's something at stake. And I think that doesn't happen easily. There needs to be some notion that there's something important being lost, that the Europe is losing out or something like that. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I think that CRA for me, last year all the conferences we went to, everybody was talking about the CRA. You'd be surprised even that we are having open source in Europe. Still have access to open source in Europe because there was a sense that there was an existential threat. Now we're moving on to implementing standards, and I think that just the involvement and the energy that the open source community put into this process has actually made the legislators aware of the importance of open source and the need to involve open source communities also in the follow-up and the standardization work. And so I think that's something that's been achieved through the CRA. I'll talk a bit more about that later, but I think that there was an initial exemption for open source, and some people thought that was in the legislative text, that this was a recognition of the importance of open source, but I actually think paradoxically it was the opposite. When that first text was introduced, the idea was, well, okay, let's not, let's exclude some hobbyists, doing open source projects. And in the end, the text, I think, was an improvement, and it has led not just to an improved text. It's not a great, it could have been better if we were involved early on, but we now have, I think, a sense that the open source matters. So the change that is a precondition for change.
I think you made both really good points because Europe as a continent, not as a legal organization, but Europe as a continent is home to a hell of a lot of open source, right? The Netherlands has got an LNet, which is constantly innovating in the networking and DNS space and security space and all sorts of stuff. You've got Linus Torvalds from Scandinavia, Finland, thank you, yes.
Which is technically Scandinavia, but it's a Nordic. It's okay.
Nordic countries, yeah. So we're the home of open source as far as that's concerned, and it is very anti-patent, right? It's by nature sharing, whereas if you look at kind of, well, I mean, I'm an implementer, right? I write software, I work at startups. Every single VC and kind of investor that we talk to, oh, how many patents do you have? Software patents? Yeah, I've literally been paid to work around people's software patents. So it's like, oh yeah, read this and then write something that works around it. Come up with a method that completely avoids this thing. They're not tangible ways to protect software, and my investors aren't going to like me saying this because we're applying for some, but they're not really a suitable protection. If you want to actually innovate and protect what you're building, build better. Be better than your competition. Don't try and make a walled garden and say, hey, we're the only ones that can do this. Just be better. It sounds difficult, but realistically, if you listen to your customers and what they actually need, basically every customer of a tech company, especially in B2B, feels like they're not being listened to by the implementers. So maybe just start by listening, right? And yeah, in terms of the tech standards and the European government and how governments evaluate the value of their innovations, ignoring open source is it's archaic. It's thinking in the old ways of manufactured products that come off an assembly line. And we still treat software engineers like this too, right? So software engineers, a whole project management system, Scrum, is designed around delivery dates in the way of an assembly line. And it's knowledge work. It's art.
Yeah, but just on the with the CRA. Sorry about the comment about Linus Torvalds because no, because actually I'm from Sweden, so and it's a bit complicated because Linus actually is a Swedish-speaking Finn. So and Scandinavia, it refers to the languages that are spoken in certain. But technically, maybe he is Scandinavian since he speaks Swedish, but he's Finnish. Sorry, no, but I just quickly, because you also wanted to come in there, but when I heard that the study that I referred to just earlier, we came up with a number that open source contributes, I don't know, 75 billion euros to the European economy or something like that, and we thought, well, and that was actually the Commission was happy with that number because they felt that this was something that justified some kind of policy action. At the same time, that's probably it's not a big enough number because when we heard that CRA, it's going to kill open source, they said, well, cybersecurity attacks, they cost the European economy 75 billion euros, a year. So it's like it's a kind of they would cancel each other out. So for them, it was an acceptable cost to kill open source, if we make Europe more, secure against cyber security attacks. So there was an important work needed to be done. That this is something that's actually has bigger importance than just 75 billion euros per year. So in any case,
yeah, I wanted to riff a little bit on this thing about culture because I think there are two aspects of European culture that I've seen. One, I definitely agree with you that there's this European. I mean, having just been at FOSDEM, again, 5,000 to 8,000 people, descending on a college campus to exchange ideas freely and talk about open source, and it's just an amazing thing that doesn't feel like it should exist, and that, to me, is a proof point of the value and the strength of open source community. However, when I was working for UK government, this was about 10 years ago, one of the things that I did, and this was pre-Brexit, by the way, one of the things that I did was represent the UK government open standards activity in some European Commission activities. And I was the one sitting at a table, literally, and I'm from the U.S. originally, right? So it was weird, sitting with a UK flag in front of me, and other representatives from other European countries around, and I was the only one talking about open source and royalty-free. Everybody else was talking about RAND and RAND and patents, and it was obvious that the conversation was being very much influenced by big integrators, big, kind of top-down software. I don't want to mention names, so I won't. But like big companies that were distorting and really holding back innovation, in my view, because those conversations were not going to lead anywhere. And it's good to see that with the CRA, things have really turned a corner because finally we have European regulation that talks about open source by name and talks about the ways that organizations can contribute back into open source and actually compels manufacturers to contribute back when they have found a fix for a particular vulnerability. So that's one of the things I'm very excited about and why I started to do some work in this space in the OpenSSF as well. So yeah, I found it, I think we're really turning a corner there, hopefully.
And given just a follow-on question to you, Dan, you've worked in companies, you're working in now, companies that prize patenting. I mean, Samsung's got a very big patent portfolio. They're very active in licensing, cross-licensing, defensive positioning. How are the challenges that you face there when you have this openness and an open source background and leading an open source kind of activity there versus the patent people?
When I bring for instance, the W3C patent policy to my patent team in Samsung, as I had to do when we were joining the Immersive Web Working Group, for instance, in W3C. When that group was formed, and any W3C group has to list its normative outputs in the charter. So the whole thing is built around the charter. And the understanding that any organization that joins a working group is licensing its essential patents in a royalty-free manner for the implementation of those things that are in the charter, and that's it. That's why it's this kind of like very limited license, actually. And when they can review that, and then they can do their patent search, and they can review the license obligations that it actually entails, and they review the very comprehensive patent policy and understand who else is involved in that organization. And that's also very important. Like, who else is going to be joining this working group? Who else is involved in W3C? What's W3C's pedigree as a standards body? By the way, it was involved in fighting back against that BT patent of the hyperlink thing that Nick mentioned. So that also plays a role. Then that creates this level of comfort. We understand this. We know how this works. Fine, you can go ahead and join. And that it's a one-time effort and investment of time and energy. I had to fly to Korea on that particular point and have a meeting in a room that was conducted entirely in Korean, where people were discussing it around me, and I was just there, but it was, then I presented my bit, and yeah, we made it happen. So that's the kind of thing that you need. But to Tim's point, or riffing on what Tim said, I think you do need a venue when you're talking about standards. You need to not only be developing the innovative thing, but you need to come together with others so that you can defend the openness of that thing. Otherwise, somebody might come after you when you become too big, as I think Nick was talking about earlier.
Yeah, so, well, in my talk earlier I mentioned OpenSOD. There is very good reason to believe that at some point Ericsson might come after me. I don't think they've got anything legally to go on against me. I did check to see if they had any patents on SR4731. Doesn't look like it. But yeah, they might try to come after me at some point. And ultimately, I don't want OpenSOD to be something that's held by my company. I want it to be transferred to a standards organization. But before we get there, it has to be used more. If it's just my company using it, then they'll just see it as, oh, they just want to pass off some liability. But in reality, it needs to be there, because if my company gets purchased at some point through some kind of M&A deal, which I would like to see it at some point in the far future, because that will make me very rich. Yes, I like money. This is why I'm not welcome at certain conferences, because I like money. Yeah, so at some point I'd like to pass this off, because if we do get bought, then that is a big risk for other implementers of that standard, because it could fall into the same trap. Everyone thought that the Bellcore standard was fine, and then it got bought by Telcordia, and Telcordia respected it. But then Telcordia got bought, and now Ericsson's not respecting that as a standard for people to implement. They've locked it down. So yeah, this is something that's, it is a problem, and you can't just release an open standard and say, hey, this is open, and then not try to ensure that it remains open for the long term.
I like money. No, it's interesting. I want to get back to what you said about FOSDEM. I attended my first FOSDEM in 2008, and I have some friends still who are this thing about culture change, it takes place on the weekend. And they are, saying, this is the true culture, open source culture, because it's about, being able to not be there because you're paid to be there, but because you choose to be there as part of the community. So it's, but, there's
are a lot of people
especially
there
in
who
Europe,
are
I think
paid
there
to
is.
be there,
Yes,
though.
Now there is, but I think, in the sense that I have friends who now have day jobs who, would like to attend more open source conferences, but they would have to take a day off work, in order to attend. So it's very important for the culture of, I think, for the history of FOSDEM and for a lot of the people who come there still, that it does take place over the weekend and it's free and everything like that. But wanted to get back to, I dropped my notes because I did write down some notes yesterday. There was the plenary panel. I want to get back to that because Amanda said something like that the pace of adoption has not been matched by the pace of understanding. And then you talked about this thing about, change there needs to be a comfort level for companies to kind of embark on something new. Did I kind of get that right? I just wanted to...
They need to figure out how it fits into their process that they already have.
Right.
And I think in order to do that, the other thing that I forgot to mention or that I should have mentioned is that sometimes you need people that are lawyers that are also familiar with open source. You need these kind of hybrid people.
Yeah.
And those people are very special and very hard to find. We actually had somebody at FOSDEM on one of the panels that introduced themselves and said, I am a lawyer. Which I love, So when you have that kind of person, I think it can also really help.
But I think those are the people that's what we're trying to do, I think, at Open Forum Europe. We've always tried to bring those people. We've done a policy event the day before FOSDEM, I think, for, more than 10 years now. And it's really about getting to those people who are going to FOSDEM, but who also are interested in policy. And of course, the number people who are interested in coming to our event, that's grown over the last few years, but I think, we always try to get to those people and that can actually communicate with, and providing a venue for those people to come to Brussels and, talk to policymakers. But I think, on this thing about creating comfort, I think that's important, the European companies, big companies who are involved in open source and who come to these events and sponsor these events and who are members of LF, for example. It's really important if we want to see policy change that those companies, especially, I'm looking at European companies, that they talk to, not just at the European level, but at the member state level in the capitals, that they have to make the point that they also rely on open source, that this is not just something that people do and attend a big FOSDEM fest on the weekend or something like that. It needs to be serious business. Otherwise, the European Commission is like, okay, that's too bad that that we're going to kill this off, but we need, we have other constituents that we're also caring about. That's really important. We care about consumers, etc., SMEs.
Tim, one thing I'll mention before you jump in. I find it interesting to hear you refer to it as we'll kill it off. The reason why this is so powerful is what I said. It's a social movement. It will outlive any political regime, including ones in Asia that seem like they're pretty powerful at this point in history. Sorry. The reality is that this is bigger than any one technology that you can design around. This isn't about a patented technology. This is about a way of life. It's a way of creating value in the new economy. And that's what people miss, is that, I love the arrogance of the Commission to think that they could kill this off. It's not possible. It's more viral than it's about 1,000 times more viral than COVID.
Is what I'm saying. I didn't say that they would kill it off, but
the great thing is in America we don't rely on money from the government to be able to get together, collaborate, and create new value. If that's what you need to do your work, then change your model, because it's working in other environments as well.
Can I just respond? Because I think the point I was trying to make is that we had a study showing that the total value of open source was a number, And then they just said, well, that's about the cost that, of cybersecurity attacks, So the point I was trying to make is that we have to make the case that this is so much bigger than that. And even if like the internet runs on open source, then it means that all the web commerce, everything, like all of that. So it's not just 75 billion or whatever. It's much bigger than that. So
I wonder if they spoke to the German government with its Linux-based systems before they decided to make that decision, because that would mean that they would have to switch to either Apple or Microsoft software, and both Apple's and Microsoft's platforms these days contain a hell of a lot of Linux. Every switch, every router contains Linux. You cannot wipe this out. The cost would have been in the trillions if they had actually tried to pull it off. And yeah,
that's what has to be made more visible, I think.
Yeah, and it's good that you mentioned what Amanda said yesterday. In that same discussion, I believe, she brought up how open source itself is not a business model. And this is something that she's been saying over previous conferences as well. And previous iterations of this conference. And of course she's right. Open source alone is not a business model. And your point about how if you need money from the government to support it, I mean, I would disagree that American companies don't get a lot of money from the government to support their existence. There's some that
I'm not talking
literally
about
live off the teat of the government.
failed companies like Boeing.
I'm not here to argue politics.
Yeah, there are plenty of failed companies like Boeing that are dead men walking. Yeah, those companies get lots of funding from the government.
2-3 minutes left.
Okay, thank you.
So it's a case of, open source as a whole. We really do need to think about, and even in open standards, how do we support this financially? How do we make this profitable for the people that work in it? And that's why I say I like money. I like to find ways that help us do this, that help people live off the work that they're creating, rather than just, begging and relying on donations.
That's a whole another panel, which I'd love to participate in, because like you mentioned the German government. I mean, there's the Sovereign Tech Agency, which is doing amazing stuff. There's also a European grant called Open. Oh God, I can't remember what it is. Something. No, the standards. The specific participation. Stand ICT. Yes. Okay. Right. For this was a grant.
Consortium.
Okay. Yeah. Which is great, like money for people to participate in standards and to participate in open source. And I'm involved in some organizations like Open Web Docs that are taking advantage of that to really build stuff in the open. So I hope to see more of that kind of stuff.
Do we have a final comment?
Yeah.
Final comment. No, another thing that Amanda said also was this thing about, that regulators know now about open source because of the CRA, but it's still complicated because they don't know who they should be talking to, who speaks for open source. Because that's something important to, be remembered. I think now, because of this notion of stewards, etc., then the foundations have stepped up to kind of be some sort of, interlocutor with the governments there. But the whole European Union is based on some notion of stakeholderism. So, you need to represent, to have, to be at the table, you have to say that you represent an interest, and an interest that could be damaged by, a regulation or something like this, so that you have something at stake. And I think this is something that we need to continue to develop, sort of what is at stake and who stands to lose,
Yeah, and I think this is what's great about Open UK and bringing us all here today and yesterday is, Open UK is trying to do that. They are trying to, help bring us together and represent us as a body, as you could think of it, and Amanda's not going to be like me saying this, but you can kind of think of it as a lobbying arm for open source, right? I know, it's not, but you can kind of think of it that way if you want to think of it in the traditional kind of how you interact with government's way.
Oh yeah, no, just I totally agree. Yeah, and I mean, also coming back to my experience at GDS, that whole organization was built from a notion of that's UK Government Digital Service, right? That organization was built from a notion of how do we take advantage of open source and open source way of thinking and get away from the traditional way that governments interact with technologies, which is to engage with a big integrator to come in and build a turnkey solution, which then requires ongoing costs and as much in. So the whole promise of that, which I do think we are seeing emerge across Europe, is that it actually lowers costs and creates better customer or citizen experience for governments to embrace that model, which means that we need open source more than ever.
I'd like to thank the panelists for the interesting discussion and not needing your food pre-chewed, which is a good thing for panelists, to be intelligent, thoughtful, and just take it. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here. And I would encourage you to follow up with the panelists on these topics. And thanks, obviously, to Amanda somewhere.